All right, let's do this. So yesterday, this article from La Presse by the columnist Étienne Paré went viral on my social media feeds, at least. And the headline is called Le Québec boude ses artistes, which translates to Quebec shuns its artists. Let's unpack this statement because I disagree with this article. And if this setup to a video on this channel sounds familiar to you, it's because 2 years ago, La Presse put out a series of articles bemoaning the state of the Quebec music industry that I also disagreed with. You can watch that here. Bonjour, hi, bienvenue, welcome. For those of you who are new here, my name is David Rishpan. I am a pianist, keyboardist, composer, arranger, DJ, and educator based here in Montreal, and I've been living here since 2002. The article in La Presse is based on data released by a company called Luminate. They just released their mid-year power rankings. They analyzed data and consumption habits for music, film, and TV across all types of platforms, physical media, and streaming. So they just released their mid-year analysis. And the crux of Etienne Paré's article and his argument is the figure that he cites from Luminate. Québécois music only accounts for 7% of all streams in Quebec. Let's unpack this. The data from Luminate is publicly available. You just give them your email address and you can download the PDF. From what is publicly available, there is only data available for Canada, not specifically for Quebec. So perhaps La Presse and Étienne Paré asked for Quebec-specific data that I don't have access to. The 7% figure comes from the section in Luminate's study where they talk about the diversity of listening habits and the diversity of media consumption. And they have a whole grid of where different countries lie on that spectrum. And the way Monsieur Paré frames it is that if Quebec were its own separate sovereign country, not opening that can of worms in this video, that's for a different channel and a different day. But if Quebec were its own separate sovereign country, we would be kind of down in the what he calls least self-sufficient, or what Luminate calls the most diverse listening habits and trends. We would be around the same percentage as Belgium and Switzerland in terms of consuming the percentage of local artists that we listen to, that we consume. The least diverse music markets, or in Monsieur Paré's framing, the most self-sufficient listening markets, here are the top 5 according to Luminate: India, Japan, Brazil, Korea, and the US. None of those 5 countries should be surprising that their music markets are self-sufficient or less diverse. I listen to more music from Brazil than I do from Canada or Quebec. The various Indian music traditions, whether it's Hindustani from the north, Carnatic from the south, or the Bollywood film music traditions, those things are massive, massive markets with global ramifications. I am not surprised that India is the most self-sufficient or least diverse music market in Luminate's study, nor should we be surprised or disappointed at that figure, at the top 5, at that list. That list does not surprise me at all. The data that Luminate put out that Monsieur Paré ignores is that in Canada, there has been growth in music consumption over the past year in all formats: streaming, vinyl records, and CDs. All 3 of those have grown. Consumption of all 3 of those formats have grown by about 4% since the end of last year. So already off the bat, I feel like this 7% figure is a little bit disingenuous. I feel like it's trying to pick a fight that doesn't necessarily exist. But my friends and colleagues who were sharing this article were very taken by this 7% figure and very disappointed with it, as we should be. We should be concerned that Québécois music only accounts for 7% of what's listened to in Quebec. So let's take that number and let's really have this conversation about why that might be, about why Québécois music is not listened to on streaming platforms as much as it should be. I mentioned this in the video I made 2 years ago, that a big part of it when it comes to streaming, in my opinion, is that the rest of the cultural ecosystem in Quebec that would affect the algorithm and the discoverability of Québécois music on streaming platforms. That cultural ecosystem is greatly lacking, and we're very late. I use Tidal as my streaming platform of choice, and I constantly get served music from Brazil, from France, from the UK, and from the US based on what I listen to. And no matter how many Quebecois artists I pre-save on Tidal, those artists, those specific artists that I have pre-saved in the past, their releases get served up to me. But in general, Quebecois releases don't make it to my new release radar on Tidal. Let's take the case and the example of everyone's favorite polka dotted aliens, Angine de Poitrine. This is the lesson I really hoped people would learn in the wake of their incredible viral success and in the wake of their massive free concert at the Montreal Jazz Festival a couple of weeks ago. The video that contributed to their rise to fame and virality was produced by KEXP, which is a radio station based out of Seattle. And it was filmed at a music conference, a music festival in France. KEXP has been making high quality videos of artists performing, whether in their studio or abroad at music conferences, music festivals. KEXP has been in the content creation game for years, if not decades, and they put out consistently high quality footage of every artist that they invite. To a lesser extent, my friend Celine, the drummer, composer, producer of Thai descent, who also lives in Montreal, she noticed a large or a significant bump in her numbers, her streaming numbers, her social media numbers after her own KEXP live session. There are other radio stations in the States, KCRW, Morning Becomes Eclectic, NPR Tiny Desk, another great example. These are platforms, these are outlets that have been doing this for years at an incredibly high level. And it is the confluence of the outlet's own notoriety with the notoriety of the artists that they book. And they go hand in hand. If KCRW or KEXP or Tiny Desk book an artist that has a following that doesn't necessarily follow these platforms already, now more and more people will discover the work that these outlets have been creating. And for people who follow KEXP, KCRW, NPR as a means of music discovery, they find out about all kinds of artists that may not make it to their own streaming algorithms or social media algorithms. Quebec does not have an equivalent of KEXP. We just don't. We desperately need one, and we don't have it. I have been involved with campus community radio in Montreal for almost the entire time I've lived here, and we are operating on shoestring budgets, none of us, none of the 4 campus community stations that I can think of in Montreal, which would be CKUT, CJLO, CISM, or CIBL, and Shuck, which is connected to UQAM. So the 5 stations, none of us, we don't have the money to produce video at a KEXP or Tiny Desk level. We just don't have the budgets for it. Think of all the things that lead to things exploding in the algorithm. It's playlisters, it's other influencers, it's other blogs, it's other outlets, you know, Pitchfork, Anthony Fantano from Needle Drop, the various curated playlists on whatever your streaming platform of choice is, BBC One, Giles Peterson, Zane Lowe, you name it. These mega influencers who have uh, developed an audience that trusts them. I can't think of a Quebecois music influencer that has the reach of the people I just named. And when Quebec artists do get a bump in their numbers, it's often from non-Quebecois influencers. I just saw something pass in my feed on Instagram yesterday. Uh, an Instagram creator named Tia Ho did a feature on the rapper Magi Merlin. Tia Ho is based in Brooklyn. Why does it take a Brooklyn creator to talk about a local Montreal artist for it to have any kind of real effect? I think another element of this problem is that habitually Quebec has tried to create their own alternative platforms instead of being present in the platforms that already have the monopoly and already exist. For example, I'm thinking of there's a streaming platform called Musique, and back in the COVID lockdowns, there was another initiative called Musique Bleu, and they were these separate entities, and they tried to get Quebecois music listeners to switch from the common global streaming platforms over to these niche specific targeted platforms. But in Illuminate's data, I think only 30% of people would consider themselves super fans who follow artists on multiple platforms, or what they call activations, I think is the term they use. It takes so much effort to try and change the listening habits of people that I feel like all the effort and money that went into these initiatives like Musique QC could have been spent in creating more playlists on Spotify, Apple Music, and Tidal that feature Quebecois artists. The other question I have for Étienne Paré and for Luminate is, what is considered Quebecois in this case? For example, to determine what is Canadian content, there is the maple, the little MAPL circle that you may have seen on the back of Canadian records. And that stands for the 4 elements that would constitute Canadian content. And you need to have a majority of those elements in Canada or Canadian for it to count as Canadian content. So that would be music, the composer, artist, the performer, production, where it was recorded, and lyrics, the lyricist. So the majority of those things have to be Canadian in order for it to count as Canadian content. There is no such denomination, as far as I know, as far as I'm aware, for what constitutes Quebecois music. So what do you consider Quebecois music? Is it people who live in Quebec, but were not born in Quebec, people who work in Quebec, but were not born in Quebec. So, am I Quebecois music because I was born in Toronto, even though I've lived here for almost 25 years? Is Ariel Posen, who's originally from Manitoba, but lives and works here, records here, and has a series of records called Mile End? Is that Quebecois music? Is Kaytranada considered Quebecois music because he's from here? So we need to define our terms. And I am surprised at the 7% number because you look at the rise of Angine de Poitrine, you look at the popularity of people like Kaytranada, Patrick Watson, the Barr brothers. I'm surprised that it is only 7%, but nowhere in his article does Étienne Paré define his terms of what he is considering Quebecois music. I do agree with Geneviève Côté, who is cited in the article, and she says something very important that we should all take to heart, that abroad, when people think of Quebecois music, and even to an extent in Quebec, when we think of Quebecois music, we think of very rootsy, folky, francophone music like Les Cowboys Fringants, like Paul Pichet. But my definition of what's Quebecois music is much, much, much broader than that. And I have a feeling that if you adopted my definition of Quebecois music, the percentage would go up. Just a hunch. So what does Quebec get right? Because I don't want to be all doom and gloom in this video. I think Quebec excels at presenting live music and live art. Obviously, Montreal is known for its festivals. There were obviously way more people attending Jazz Fest this year than in previous editions, and now Nuit d'Afrique just finished. Just for Laughs is still running. You know, Les Francopholies were earlier this summer. We have festivals all summer where Montreal is known for its festivals. And in addition to the festivals, every borough of Montreal has a series of free concerts in local parks. Even outside of Montreal, I just did a show in Laval at an initiative called Zone Musicale. I would venture to guess that the vast majority, if not the entirety of the free summer programming across Montreal, across the other municipalities around Montreal in the greater Montreal area, and I would even venture a guess that, you know, throughout Quebec, I would say the vast majority, if not the totality of the programming, is all Quebecois artists, all local artists. I think that's where we excel. The touring network that exists throughout Quebec, whether it's Maison de la Couture, which are kind of cultural centers that at least every borough in Montreal has one, and then there are other Maison de la Couture throughout the province. The theaters in various cégeps or colleges that are also integrated into the touring network throughout the province. It is a resource and a network that is unlike anything I've seen in any other province, you know, presenting live music and live cultural events at an accessible price point or for free. I think Quebec does that very, very well. Now, does that translate into the audience then going home and streaming these artists or buying their CDs? Who knows? But the listening consumption of live music in Quebec is definitely centered on local artists. The big major festivals like Festival d'été de Québec and Jazz Fest perhaps being an exception. This is a discussion that I think needs to be had in every scene, not just in Quebec, but I think everyone needs to talk very honestly about how do we promote local artists on streaming platforms of our choice? How do we support our local music scenes in every way possible? I think those are very real discussions to have. And here's the core of the problem I have with La Presse, because this is the second time in 2 years that I'm making a video picking apart their arguments about the state of the Québécois music industry. If you really care about Québécois culture and Québécois music, use your time, your energy, your money, and your influence to promote Québécois music. This article that went viral by Étienne Paré in La Presse, you know what it doesn't have? A playlist of Québécois music. There is no playlist attached of Québécois music curated either by Étienne Paré or anyone else at La Presse. There is no playlist attached to this article. If you really cared about bumping the numbers of Québécois artists on streaming, you would curate playlists. I can guarantee you that with the readership La Presse has and the influence that La Presse still holds in Montreal and throughout the province, if you put out a weekly playlist of new Quebec releases, of artists that are touring throughout Quebec or Quebec artists that are on tour abroad, you would bump the numbers of everybody. If you really, really cared about promoting Quebecois culture, you would write about Quebecois artists. Dominique Fils-Aimé is just wrapping up a tour of some of the major jazz festivals in Europe. Celine, the Thai drummer, composer, producer that I mentioned earlier, just wrapped up her European tour as well. The Brooks are still currently on tour throughout Europe, and all three of those artists tour extremely hard. And I think abroad, when people think of who represents the Montreal scene right now, the Quebec scene right now, those three artists are at the top of people's minds. I would have much rather this been an article about the Quebecois artists who get hired by international artists. I'm thinking of, Silvana Estrada, the great Mexican songwriter who brought Joe Grass and Remy Jean Leblanc onto Tiny Desk as part of her band. Why didn't you do an interview with Joe? Why didn't you do an interview with RJ? Why don't you do a profile of the people in the trenches, the artists, the producers, the musicians, the composers who make the Montreal and Quebec music scene what it is? I went to a memorial jam session for the late saxophonist Roberto Murray, who passed away last week. And Roberto was a massive influence on so many musicians throughout this province, throughout Quebec. And somebody came up to me and mentioned that they really appreciated the videos I had done on this channel about Camille Jalina and about Jérôme Beaulieu, about Misk. And this is something that's been dear to my heart for as long as I've worked in media, whether it's been radio, writing for magazines, blogging, and now YouTube, Instagram, video format. I was born in Toronto, but I really consider myself a product of Montreal. Like, I grew up artistically here in Montreal. I became who I am here in Montreal. And I have always believed that Montreal artists, Quebecois artists are world class. And there are various mechanisms that are in place because of how we've decided that we want our music industry to work that prevent these artists, many of whom I get to call my friends, that prevent them from being as well known as they should be. As an Anglophone that is bilingual, I mean, really, my life is split across 4 languages these days. I am so proud to be a part of these artistic communities. I am so lucky to call these people my friends. And I want to share that with you because I'm over the hand wringing. I'm so done with the hand wringing and the complaining. I know this video has been a lot of complaining, but now I want to do something about it. So keep an eye out on this channel for the rest of the year. I want one part of this channel, one element of this channel, to be a showcase for Québécois musicians, no matter what language they speak. Thank you so much for watching. My name's David Rishpan. If you haven't done so, please click all the buttons below the video. I'm going to link to a couple of other content creators and channels that I think are doing really good work to document the Quebec scene. I'm going to link to them in the video description. If you love what's coming out of Montreal and Quebec and you want more of that in your algorithm, go follow these people. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.